Hey again, everybody. It's lecture three or lesson three on the civil rights movement, and we're trying to give you a little bit of a taste for the big picture of this. Some of the things, such as how does the federal government start to support more overturning of things like Plessy versus Ferguson, presidential actions to support implementation of policies. And then today, what we want to pick up with is we want to start to look a little bit more at the third branch, which is how does Congress or the legislative branch pass legislation. And so we're going to look at that. We're also going to take a look at how does the civil rights movement take a turn to an extent. We didn't mention this in our last session, but a little bit more background on some of the leadership with people like Malcolm X. He tends to get a lot of attention, and we know about him. But King is is kind of like the big name that you come across quite often. But the real quick thing on this is Malcolm X, as we know, is a very important leader. He has a lot of opinions regarding King and his leadership, and we'll look at that with one of our excerpts either during class today or as we have time with our whole class sessions. And basically, what we notice is that even Malcolm X does a little bit of a change. He has a disagreement with Elijah Muhammad, who was his longtime spiritual advisor. Basically breaks off from him and is going to obviously kind of go in his own direction. His pilgrimage to Mecca has a lot to do with some of his changes and looking at maybe the degree of racial separation that some people thought was still necessary in that camp. And then even, a lot of his assassination happens about 3 years prior to Martin Luther King Jr.'s, who was actually assassinated by kind of like an opponent of his. So that's going to be another thing that we take a look at. And then also the rise of movements such as Black Power, as well as Black Panther movement. We will say a little bit about those, but we're going to start off our attention with the role of Congress. So our objectives are pretty important. How does the passage of new legislation pieces, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the ball rolling with the eventual 24th Amendment, the states will eventually ratify. Okay, so, and then also, of course, the untimely death of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 as a significant turning point in the direction of civil rights. So just something to really keep in the back of your mind. So if you're kind of wondering, why has Congress been a bit more perhaps on the slow side? There's different theories out there. There's a case to be made that John F. Kennedy, had he survived his untimely assassination in 1963, and assuming he would have been reelected in 1964, would have had maybe a more aggressive civil rights agenda. However, what we do know, guys, is that his successor, a gentleman by the name of Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ as we know him as, is going to make a lot of the civil rights a focal point of what became known as his Great Society, and also a part of his war on poverty with other things. Why do we bring this up? Well, the reason being is because Congress is eventually going to be pressured, or whatever word you want to use, to actually pass a couple of what we call landmark pieces of legislation. Now, I want to explain to you a few things. The word landmark we attached to the Brown cases, especially Brown Part 1. And so therefore, the fact that we call these pieces of legislation landmark pretty much means, one, they're important, and two, they're going to be what you might would call life-changing. Okay, and so just really quick, these, if you want to read them for yourselves, you can. They're laws, so they can be on the lengthy side. But the basic nuts and bolts, guys, that we've been talking about a little bit is, there's a school of thought out there that the federal government, whether it's the president, Congress, Supreme Court, the executive branch through the departments that we associate with the cabinet, have a role with this process. So what do we find? Well, the Congress is going to give some guidance and also some support, and you notice that with the breakdown. So what basic provisions exist with some of these things that we're looking at? Well, first of all, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, so first of all, take a look at what it says. Justice Department. So we're talking about the Attorney General, basically, guys, his department, if you've ever heard the position, which a lot of you have, And what do they have the right to do? Enforce school desegregation, okay, and ensure fair voting practices. So what they're trying to do again is to put more responsibility, or at least more, shall we say, power, authority in the hands of the federal government to do that. Now, the other things it does, guys, I think are equally important. Ban the use of different voter registration standards for blacks as well as whites. Now, a lot of you remember talking about some of the Reconstruction policies that limited voting. The Voting Rights Act that comes about a year later, that will do something pretty similar. Prohibited discrimination in public accommodations. Think about the debates that we've had in Supreme Court cases. Plessy, well, that only really applied to things like perhaps train cars. Well, the reality is it applied to things like schools, as we know. It applied to things like bathrooms, water fountains, other public facilities. What this act is making clear, that is no longer going to obviously be acceptable by the legislative branch standards. And a lot of people ask the question, well, man, the Brown case is 10 years old at this point, the first one anyway. Why is Congress now just getting ready, or being more aggressive with their actions? We'll get to that after we watch the video on this. And then perhaps the one that maybe, I don't know if I would say gets overlooked, but certainly it's something that I think is worth really kind of bringing your attention, is banning discrimination in hiring practices. But we're not just looking at the idea of race here. We're looking at race, sex, religion, or national origin. Now, we have not talked extensively about women's rights, but we're going to when we get to the next unit on activism. This is a big law that, yes, has a civil rights implication for African Americans, of course, but it also has a lot of other effects. Hold on to that for the next week or two. Okay, so that's a big thing. So the Congress gets the ball rolling. Now the question is, okay, well, what is the Voting Rights Act then? Well, it's pretty much the way that it sounds, allowing federal officials, again, federal involvement, to register voters where local officials block registration. Yes, guys, there are, in especially parts of the Deep South, some pretty significant, things that fall into that category. Elimination of literacy tests, and also the idea of other voter barriers. Okay, that is huge. Guys, I mean, if you think about it, if you've ever heard the expression voter blocks, okay, there is a case to be made that voter blocks, 1964 was an election year, by the way, if you didn't know that. The argument is that voter blocks matter with keeping, or at least putting, people in office. So therefore, you're giving power to the idea of people's voice in a way that goes into voting. And then the question is, well, what are the other things that restricted voting? Well, we talked about the idea of poll taxes, right? Paying a kind of tax, or a fee, if you will, some monetary value to be able to vote. Many states still have those. When the 24th Amendment is going to be fully ratified by the 3/4 of the states after the 2/3 of Congress, what happens? Well, what happens is it's no longer constitutional. The question is, was it effective? Well, take a moment to actually look at this map, draw a conclusion for yourself, and we'll come back to it. Okay, so the question I have for all of you is, you clearly see that there are some states, most of them, have some progress. Now, the question I would ask you individually, what would you all consider progress? Dramatic, whatever. Okay, now, clearly, you notice that the majority of the states, with a couple of exceptions, do have some change. Mississippi stands out to me quite a bit. 6% around 1965, within 6 years, which, by the way, is the year before the 1972 election. You notice that their voting registration for African Americans has obviously multiplied by 10. Okay, Alabama 3 times. Georgia has a pretty good amount. Now, Tennessee and North Carolina, those are things to consider. Why would a state not actually see numbers increasing? Okay, and there's a very similar kind of trend in 1971, the following election the year after, when you have the lowering of the voting age, which, by the way, was a constitutional movement as well. You don't really see the dramatic increase in voting for that 18 to 24 range. Okay, And a lot of people ask the question, is it because, people have been turned off from politics? There's a variety of different factors and issues that come up. Okay. So what I think is important now for us to do is to transition just really quickly to the idea of this Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I want to show you a very quick video that kind of gives you about a 3-minute overview. Okay. Now, this video that we're going to look at just really quick is going to give us a really nice overview. Okay, if I can find it, that is. Okay. And this overview is pretty much, again, pretty quick. It's going to tell you a little bit about the history, the background. Okay. Here we go. And then we will talk about it with some time during our whole class lessons. So watch and we'll see what you think.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. Divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
There's warm applause from members of both parties as the president sets to work. It is work. He uses nearly 100 pens to affix his signature and date. Souvenirs go to Republican leader Everett Dirksen and Democratic whip Hubert Humphrey. The president seems to have mastered the art of just touching each pen to the paper. Integration leader Martin Luther King receives his pen, a gift he said he would cherish. The Department of Justice will enforce the law if necessary, and G-Man Chief J. Edgar Hoover is present. Another group of pens is reserved for the Kennedys, and the Attorney General is entrusted with a half dozen. Now, in this summer of 1964, the Civil Rights Bill is the law of the land. In the words of the president, it restricts no one's freedom so long as he respects the rights of others.
Okay, guys, so my question to all of you is, what stood out to you about how President Johnson is actually going to promote the idea of this? Because I recently attended a webinar, just a real quick point on this, guys, where, whether you're talking about a civil rights issue, something that's dealing with COVID-19 or whatever, of course, that's a pretty recent event, as we know. I heard one historian say that nothing, how did he word it? Nothing easy always is going to come to the president's desk. So he's really, I think one thing that stood out to me in one of his excerpts that you heard him talk about here is he mentioned this is not meant to be vengeful. It's not meant to divide. It's also meant, but it is meant to end divisions. And I think another thing, justice and hope. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, you saw clearly Martin Luther King Jr. A lot of you have heard of the Selma March, which we did not talk a lot about, but again, another demonstration. The one thing, guys, that is interesting, if you ever watch the movie Selma, it's a very interesting depiction of this. It's got some interesting historical relevance. One thing I took from that movie, watching it, just before we move on, is King is constantly, hey, we need a civil rights bill. We need a voting rights act, help us out here. There was constantly, hey, this March on Washington is not a new idea. It goes back to the 1940s. Kendi, what do you think about it? Okay, well, Kendi eventually was like, okay, we're going to support it. The president is in a tough position. Okay, so what we notice is the question is, guys, why does the civil rights movement take a turn? Well, think about what we talked about if you go back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with even some of the division with people like W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, the idea of tactics, the idea of strategies, goals, and then also maybe to a large extent, the idea of immediate versus gradual improvement. Okay, now there's a little more to it than this. We're going to keep this basic. If you remember in our last lesson, we talked about mostly tactics that were nonviolent, direct action based. Okay, and we talked about a group by the name of SNCC. Well, guess what happens with SNCC? They're going to have a change in leadership. You notice here, one of the more important names that perhaps you don't hear about as much as King and Malcolm X is Stokely Carmichael. Now, kind of an interesting story with him is he eventually changes his name to Kwame Ture. And if you've ever heard of Black Power, which a lot of you have, if you've done your reading, you have, he is going to be the guy who basically writes almost like the instruction manual, you could say, at least from his point of view, of the idea of Black Power. Blacks taking more, shall we say, charge, if you will, of their communities, politically, economically, etc. Okay, and so what does he basically do? Well, his argument is that as far as tactics are concerned, you're not really seeing the results with nonviolence that basically should be yielded. So in other words, again, impatience, you could argue. So this gentleman gets involved with SNCC, and SNCC is going to take quite a bit of a change in direction. Okay, now one thing to not get entirely mixed up is that there are some connections, you could say, with Black Power and some of the other groups that you hear about. But for the most part, the Black Panther Party platform that we'll talk about in a second, that is going to be more unique to them. Okay, so Black Power is going to be defining these goals. To an extent, tactics become more, perhaps militant, definitely more hands-on in the sense of maybe even like, demonstrations being, a bit more violent in nature, some people would argue. And even the idea of Black Power, the salute that you see, we're going to watch a video clip on that. This is absolutely huge. It represents a big part of pride, right? This idea of Black nationalism, Black, pride in community, et cetera, et cetera. Now, one thing that needs to be noted is that, a lot of people are like, is there a connection between Martin Luther King Jr. and Black Power? I would argue that he does believe in Black Power, but if you read King pretty closely, he does not view it the same way as a figure like Carmichael would, or the Black Panthers, or some of the other people that you come across, like Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, people like that you associate with the Black Panther Party getting started. That's one thing for us to keep in mind. Okay, one really downside of 1968 is definitely going to be, of course, King's assassination. Okay, he's kind of the face of the franchise. A lot of people would say with the civil rights movement, era, whatever you want to call it, when he's going to be assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, of course, the movement is going to be affected. There's no question. It's a different kind of death in a sense than you would find with somebody like Frederick Douglass. Different circumstances with the death happening, but at the end of the day, you're talking about a leader that was extremely important to the cause of civil rights. So what I want to do really quick before we transition to the Black Panther movement, I want to show you how important certain things like the demonstrations, the one that you see like the 1968 Olympic salute. The Olympics, as some of you might know, were held in Mexico City. And of course, Tommy Smith and John Carlos were pretty adamant on a world stage of illustrating this. Let me show you the video, and then we'll talk more about the rise of the Black Panthers as time allows.
Mal Whitfield, a prominent American Negro athlete, has called on American Negro athletes to boycott the Olympics. So what's your reaction to that?
That's something no one can understand, because the fundamental basis of the Olympic movement is no discrimination whatsoever because of race, religion, color, or political affiliations. This is one international event where there is no discrimination.
The year of 1968 stood as a transitional period in the American Civil Rights Movement. It was a year that not only saw the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, but also one of the most memorable moments in Olympic history. Tommy Smith and John Carlos entered the 200-meter final with victory in the mouth, both literally and figuratively.
When that gun went off, it was just phenomenal. John just took off. And then somewhere on the straightaway, Tommy the Jet decided to do his thing, what Tommy generally does. And John looked to his right, see Tommy going past him, and then Peter Norman ended up nabbing John.
As Smith and Carlos took their place on the podium to accept their gold and bronze medals, it was then in which both raised their hands in the air with the Black Power salute.
My reaction to it was, oh boy, wow, it was, no one truly, maybe Lee Evans had a clue that something was going to happen to Tommy and John, but no one truly on the team had a really insight to what was going to happen, other than folks want to do their own thing. That was the ultimate statement. They were anointed and appointed to do what they did. And after that, no one else had to really do anything of that magnitude.
Smith and Carlos were suspended and banned from the Olympics because of their actions. Those actions, however, stand as one of the most influential movements in African American sports history. With your Black History Fact, I'm Nicholas Love.
Okay, so guys, the question is, why would people really have a problem with this salute, right? There's a lot of question marks. Is the Olympics supposed to have political statements to it, et cetera, et cetera? Well, I think we would agree that definitely the event and what the two gentlemen did particularly was a sign of them standing up against the idea of racial injustice. And kind of an interesting detail, just really quick before we look at the Black Panthers, is somebody once said to Smith, okay, what exactly did this represent? There was an extreme outcome. The guys got in some troubles, as you heard. And this is what Smith said, and it's not in front of you, but it's interesting. He said, if I win, I am an American, not a Black American. But if I did something bad, then they would say that I am a Negro. We are Black and we are proud of being Black. Black America will understand what we did tonight, end quote. So I'll leave that for you to kind of do a little bit of thinking about. But again, that idea of pride and so forth. So what I want us to kind of end with is the idea of the rise of this Black Panther platform, as you can see in 1966. Okay. And so if you think about it, we're going to read through it just really briefly in a second, a couple of highlights to it. But something, guys, for you to keep in mind is what goals stand out. Are they that dramatically different than the kind of goals that we associate with the King side of this? Do you think MLK Jr. would oppose the principles of these goals? Would you label any of the ideas that they present as radical? By the way, the document will be there for you to look at if you'd like to on your own time. Could nonviolent direct action be used to achieve the goals of the Black Panthers? Again, we're looking at differences in perhaps the strategies, the means to the ends. Okay, so what are we thinking about when we think of Black Panthers? Well, it's really easy to kind of maybe overlook some of the things that we associate with them. So this is pretty much not the whole platform, but part of it. But basically, what are we looking at? We're looking at a set of things that they want to do. So we're going to read over just a couple of them to give you some food for thought. So we want what? Freedom. Now, I would say that in principle, you're looking at why do we have a Civil Rights Act in 1964? Why do we have a Voting Rights Act in 1965? Well, the easy answer to that are certain freedoms that are unfortunately being restricted or in some cases denied. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. Okay, that's where historians are like, okay, is that much dramatically different than something that King would advocate for? Okay, something for you to kind of keep in the back of your minds. We want full employment for our people. We believe the federal government is responsible and obligated to give every man what? Employment or a guaranteed income, and employ all of its people and give a high standard of living. Okay, now it's interesting to note that by 1966, and we'll look at this more next week, Lyndon B. Johnson in his Great Society and War on Poverty is moving in a direction where we are seeing a degree of this with education reform, even like the idea of affirmative action policy, extending health care, Medicare, Medicaid, the Department of Housing and Urban and Housing Development, gets established as a cabinet department, all those things. We want decent housing. Again, another economic factor. Here's another one. We want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society. And then I think it's also interesting, we want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of Black people. Okay. Now, we looked at a couple of disturbing images yesterday during what was going on in Birmingham, and you saw the dogs, you saw the high-powered water hoses and things like that. And guys, police brutality, I mean, a lot of you have heard of Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, those are things that are not just in the modern day, modern being by our standards now, that just automatically popped up. Okay, so that's one of the things that we basically find. And then this last objective, or one of the last ones, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. All right, and I think it's interesting, if you look where I have my cursor, a United Nations supervised plebiscite to be held throughout the Black colony. So that's an interesting thing. We're looking at international recognition to this problem. And then, not to bring too much attention to this, but I think it's relevant. Where do we find these words when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve political bands? What's that? The American Founding Declaration of Independence. Okay, so that's the scenario that we're seeing with some of the advocacy of these different strategies and these different kinds of ways of looking at kind of moving the civil rights movement forward. Now, I want to end by asking you all to consider one major thing, and that is when you think of Martin Luther King Jr., okay, it's very easy to kind of come to this conclusion that everybody was on his side, or at least a sizable portion were. I'm leaving a document that we're gonna discuss in Thursday and Friday in our whole class lesson. I like to call this the evaluating the dissenters to King excerpt assignment. Now, this is not something that you're physically going to turn in, but we're actually going to work through it in class that day. I want to encourage you guys to think about things like, why would not all African Americans agree with the outcome of Brown the way that it went down, right? Or the way that it was implemented. Okay. Why would not all African Americans agree with nonviolent direct action? Okay. What would be a reason why some African Americans, and believe it or not, the last excerpt here, excerpt 4, is clearly illustrating this. Why would some African Americans not actually be as optimistic of an act like a Civil Rights Act of 1964. For the most part, this is all the lecturing of the week that we're going to do. Hope you all have had a great week. Ask yourself the big picture question: what do I know better about civil rights? How does the leadership have a division on the issue? And maybe more importantly, if you are a leader, and this is something I want us to discuss, guys, in our whole class discussions, do you think that nonviolent direct action, or perhaps more militant or different strategies, would have been better to move the cause of civil rights along? Something for us to think about. Have a good one. Email me with any questions that you all might have, and hope you all are doing well. Thank you.